Thanks for clicking on this video. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon and turn on all notifications to keep up to date with the latest information and discussions. Sometimes you just gotta put your differences aside and work together as one. And I'm talking about the geeky stuff, not the, other stuff. Hey guys, MasakoX here. Now the topic of fusion is probably one of the biggest points in Dragon Ball lore, and it's probably one of the most well known. It really signified to the world that, in reality, the stakes were going to be lower than ever because if things were getting really bad, all you had to do was just fuse two of the strongest characters and you'd have your instant fix right there. Luckily for us, even if the characters were to fuse, it didn't always guarantee a win. Or so you thought, based on current information. I love the idea of fusion. I'm pretty sure that when you watched Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z as a kid, that the whole idea of two characters fusing together was a relatively novel concept. Now before we continue, I must give you a warning. There are going to be some little spoilers talked about in this video, and I will try and make them as brief as possible, and it's not going to ruin your total experience of the movie if you haven't watched it already. But I've done it a week in advance, that means as many people in the US and kind of most of Europe as possible can actually understand what I'm talking about here. But for the most part, we're talking about stuff that we already know, so I'm just giving you a full disclosure before we continue on. Alright, are you still here? You want to find out more about fusion? Okay, good. Alright, thanks for sticking around. With the advent of the new Broly movie, as well as some of its story elements basically being plastered everywhere so you can't even hide from it, I'm looking at you, Bandai. Haverok and I decided to take a step back and actually think, okay, well, how did fusion come about in the first place? What are the mechanics? What makes it tick, as it were? It's not just two people coming together. The fusion concept is one of the most important and most well-known types and tropes of Dragon Ball Z. I'd say it's at least the third most talked about Dragon Ball Z trope. You know, other than Super Saiyan and Kamehameha. And yes, you're more than welcome to argue the idea that the Potara fusion is just as recognizable as the dance, as well as Vegito's personality and his, quite forward pose in Fighters. So before we get into the in-world explanation about the fusion topic, as well as Toriyama's own interpretation on the outside of it, we decided to do a little bit of cultural research to see if there's anything backing up or kind of giving Toriyama inspiration for the idea of two characters coming together to form one whole new whole. Because, shock horror, fusion isn't just in Dragon Ball. And anyone who's ever played Yu-Gi-Oh! Or any other trading card game can easily attest to that. Most sources that were able to track the idea of fusion, thank you mostly TV tropes, seem to indicate that the first text-based explanation in terms of pop culture and any kind of literature comes from the 17th century in the form of the poet John Milton. Milton's poem Paradise Lost is the biggest example of fusion that we could find. In this most important piece of literature, two angels come together to form one brand new being. Now they do achieve this on a spiritual level, so any of you shippers out there, don't get your hopes up. I'm just putting that out there now. Because I'm not sure whether Vegeta or Goku could actually love each other. And when it comes to the idea of John Milton playing a big impact in Dragon Ball's concept of fusion, and whether literature could even play a part in such a shonen anime, well, it's up for a debate at the very least. It's hard to understand or actually try and guess whether Toriyama was even aware of the poet Milton or any kind of idea of angel fusion. Despite it being plausible because Toriyama does like to borrow from Western literature as well as science fiction movies, it's hard to really gauge whether he was a fan of poetry. But it doesn't mean that it was overlooked entirely in terms of pop culture as well as any kind of thing going out of Japan. We actually got something that could easily be linked to Milton in the form of Super Sentai, most particularly Gosei Sentai Dairanger from 1993-1994. Or for anyone who watches Power Rangers and not too sure what Dairanger is, it's that superhero thing where you get White Ranger in it. Some of the monsters of the day in that show could easily be considered to have practiced some kind of fusion of sorts, akin to the angel concept that Milton provided. And yes, you could easily argue the Milton thing in terms of the Namekian fusion, because we will talk about that for now. It's worth actually discussing. And yes, you could easily argue that Namekian fusion was the first type before Metamoran or Potara, way before, like 2 or 3 years before. But I feel like you couldn't really consider it as another type because, to me, it feels like more of a glorified absorption rather than an actual fusion of two beings. Based on the dialogue and the way that it was done about on Planet Namek between Piccolo and Nail, It feels like that it's more of an essence of one person going into another, because Piccolo quite clearly states that he is going to be the dominant personality and that Nail is going to fade away into the background, and in the original, Nail goes away entirely, only lending his power and some of his persona, but realistically, it's still Piccolo managing the legs, managing the body, and his memories are pretty much Piccolo. The fusion that we're most familiar with, Metamoran and Potara, doesn't really work that way. What you basically do is you fuse two people together and then you see what happens. So when it comes to those two types of fusion that we most know, when did that actually come about in the manga? Well, that actually came about 3 years later or so in 1994, and it wasn't for the likes of Goku or Vegeta. That didn't happen in the manga at all. That came about from their offspring. On July 26, 1994, in Weekly Shonen Jump number 34, Gotenks was debuted to the world, for better or for worse. Okay, Masako, enough about the history, enough about the contextual references, let's get to the point. Why did Toriyama come up with fusion? Why? He kinda didn't, if things are led to be believed, at least not in its entirety. And this is Toriyama, remember, so it really shouldn't surprise you that the idea of Toriyama coming up with something from outside help, it's not a big whoop. And especially if you're overly familiar with the whole idea of editorial meddling that has been around in Toriyama's career ever since he began in the late 70s. Now when it comes to fusion, for example, let's actually talk about it, because this time it didn't come from an editor. It came from a pal of his, as he explains in an interview for Daizenshuu number 6 from 1995. If I remember correctly concerning the concept of fusion, I was talking about how, as a concept, there's nothing stronger than a Super Saiyan, and Katsura-kun, Masakazu Katsura-sensei, who I usually just joke around with and say idiotic things with, said, there's no choice but for them to fuse then. So I said, whoa, sometimes even you say something good. It's the first time you've ever made yourself useful. That's how that plot point was born. Hey, that's not a nice thing to say about one of your pals, Toriyama. Now, for those of you who don't know, Masakazu Katsura is another manga artist as well as a really close friend of Toriyama, so it stands to reason that there would be a little bit of banter between them. Katsura's best known works are the series Video Girl I, as well as the 4-part manga series Z-Man. And if you take a look at those two examples, it doesn't really surprise me that the whole idea of fusion was tabled by Katsura. It was a way of him basically joking, saying, hey, why don't you do what I do? The whole idea of fusion could have easily been just between two friends just joking around with each other, instead of basically an editor telling Toriyama, hey, you should do this because this makes moolah. At this point, Katsura does actually try and distance himself from this. He does kind of just say, oh, it's just a rumor, or even if it was true, Toriyama may not have been listening and he would have come up with it like kind of later on, like it was embedded in his conscious or something. He wouldn't have heard about that directly. But then if you can counter that, Toriyama probably didn't get that much input from his director and editor at the time, Yu Kondo. He was a very hands-off editor. So I think Toriyama would have been left kind of clutching for straws, and then he would have just thought, maybe that fusion thing? Yeah, alright. But I think it might also be valid that Katsura may have just been trying to distance himself away from it just to be polite, so that means Toriyama would get all the credit, and that Katsura wouldn't be seen as trying to steal his thunder. But one thing is for certain. The whole idea of fusion made Toei and Shueisha and Studio Bird a whole lot of money. Because seriously, the merchandise for fusion is incredible. There is even a Gogeta themed toothbrush. So that's the real world angle, so let's take a look at the in-world one. It is said that Goku learnt the fusion technique from the Metamorans or the Metamors, depending on what you watch. They are an alien race, kind of like the Yardrats, but this time he met them in the other world. Sadly, since the Metamorans didn't get the same treatment that the Yardratians did in terms of a flashback during the kind of more down-paced moments, we don't even know what the Metamorans look like. The only thing that we can actually try and guess upon is their attire. But it is worth noting that in Resurrection F, the whole idea of fusion via that way is known to Frieza, so maybe the Galactic Emperor had something to do with their extinction and why they're in the other world. Because if that's the case, if the Metamorans found out that Goku is now in the other world and he was the one to take out Frieza and stop his evil rule, then I think this would be a very reasonable reward to actually lend him one of his other techniques. So he didn't actually steal it, he was gifted this technique. As to how this actual fusion works, it has to be between two people of equal height and equal power level, although it is said that that can vary from time to time and whether Toriyama feels like trying to write some kind of nuanced plot in some way. And of course in various video games like Dragon Ball Fusions, it is noted that, in a way, Metamoran fusion can work with up to 5 people. So for the last couple of years, a lot of people have been thinking, oh hey, what if all the Saiyans fused together, like the Battle of Gods thing, everyone fused together instead? That would be pretty cool. But yeah, I think we need to broach that topic when we get to it, so I think we'll start off with a 3-way fusion. I would like to see that happen in the anime, and whether Toriyama actually even remembers that that was a thing. The total fusion time is 30 minutes, but this can actually go down quite drastically depending what type of power you have stacked on top of it. We're looking at Gotenks Super Saiyan 3, you could only hold it for 5 minutes. And it's now kind of being put into question about the 1-hour cooldown afterwards. It's not really certain whether this was actually mooted in the actual Broly movie, but yeah, there's meant to be a 1-hour cooldown before you can actually fuse again, because otherwise it's quite broken. So Toriyama, could you care to explain? So what about the other one, Masako? What about Potara? Why are you neglecting it? Ah yes, the infamous Potara fusion. The one that caused a lot of controversy in Dragon Ball Super, if you remember. In reality, it's actually the easier of the 2 fusions because you don't need to learn an elaborate dance or anything like that. All you need to do is just put on an earring on separate ears, one on the left and one on the right, you come together and boom, you got a brand new fusion with a new set of clothing and something which in a way is a little bit more stable, or at least that's what we thought of in Dragon Ball Z. The really big stumbling block is that you need to know a Supreme Kai, or can at least get access to the Potara earrings in the first place. The concept of Potara was simply, since fusion was a plot point that was already taken by one of the movies, I wondered what I should do. I'd always been drawing earrings on the Supreme Kai, so I thought, perhaps I can use these. As for the earrings, or they were just for decoration. I mean, I can understand that. You don't want to cause confusion by having Gogeta in the series as well as in the movies. Something new with its own set of rules and parameters. Something that actually could raise the stakes or add a little bit of risk and chance into the equation. How about making this fusion permanent? Or at least we think it's permanent. Something that means that Goku and Vegeta would no longer be around and you'd only have this one character in concept for forever. I mean, yeah, now that we know in Dragon Ball Super, if you're not a Kai or a Supreme Being, then it only lasts for about an hour or so, or about 7 minutes if you burn through it in Super Saiyan Blue. If a living and a dead person fuse, the result will be living. If a fused being dies, he or she will remain fused. If the earrings are removed or destroyed, nothing will happen if the fusion is permanent, but the fused being will defuse if it is temporary. If the fused being defuses, both individuals will retain the memories of the fusion, as well as some memories from the other individual. And actually, in a way, you could say that nowadays, based on how it actually works and the way they actually convey themselves, Potara fusion and Metamora fusion for Goku and Vegeta results in a very similar person. They're basically the same in terms of power, as well as their actual persona, so it just depends on what they have to hand at the time. You can easily make the case that with Potara, it can vary differently depending on who is actually fusing. The Elder Kai, Kibito Kai. These people are the examples of Potara fusion, but if you notice, they only have one voice, and there is an explanation for that. That is down to the fact that there is one personality in that mix that is far more dominant than the other. The Elder Kai fused with a witch, albeit involuntarily, but the Elder Kai's personality was far greater, so you don't actually hear the witch as a stereo voice. With Kibito Kai, Kibito was subservient to the Supreme Kai, so therefore the Supreme Kai only has his voice for Kibito Kai. Not that it really matters because he's just the space version of Krillin. As for Vegito, Goku and Vegeta have very strong personalities, so therefore their voice is actually stereo. So in conclusion, fusion is awesome, fusion is very handy and very unique to Dragon Ball, and fusion came about from one of Toriyama's greatest assets and greatest tools, convenience. We hope that you enjoyed this little journey into fusion, and I hope this cleared some things up after you've seen the movie, and I hope that you actually enjoyed said movie. And we also hope that you guys enjoy what we've got in store for you in the new year. So what do you guys think? Do you feel a little bit more clued up about the likes of fusion, or are you still a little bit unsure of it? Leave a comment below, and let's get this discussion going. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Until the next one, be sure to like and subscribe. Catch you later!